A 17-year-old boy walks through Gestapo headquarters carrying forged documents. His hands don't shake. His voice doesn't crack when German officers bark questions. He's been trained to pass as male: the walk, the posture, the cold stare that says he belongs here. What the Nazis don't know is that beneath the loose jacket and short-cropped hair is Wanda Gertz, one of the youngest assassins in the Polish resistance. In her pocket is a list of collaborators. 3 names, 3 executions she will carry out in the next 72 hours. The Gestapo officers wave her through. They see a messenger boy. They don't see the 9mm pistol strapped to her ribs or the cyanide capsule sewn into her collar. What they especially don't see is the fury of a girl who watched her family torn apart by occupation, who learned to kill before she learned to love, who became a ghost moving through Warsaw's streets, dispensing justice 1 bullet at a time. In 6 months, she will be captured, tortured, sentenced to death. But right now, in this moment, she is invisible, lethal, unstoppable. This is the story of Wanda Gertz, the girl assassin who disguised as a boy to kill Nazis. In the 1920 seconds was a city rebuilding itself from the ashes of the First World War. Wanda Gertz was born into this fragile piece on January 3, 1926. The youngest daughter of a middle-class Polish family that believed in education, dignity, and the sovereignty of their reborn nation. Her father was a civil servant. Her mother, a devout Catholic who instilled in her children the difference between right and wrong with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. Wanda grew up surrounded by stories of Polish resistance during the partitions. Tales of heroes who refused to surrender their language, their faith, their identity. She was a spirited child, small for her age, quick to anger when she witnessed injustice, protective of her older siblings. The Gertz household was one of books, heated political discussions, and quiet patriotism. Then, on September 1, 1939, everything ended. Wanda was 13 years old when the German bombs fell on Warsaw. The invasion lasted 27 days. Wanda watched from her apartment window as the Luftwaffe turned her city into rubble. The screaming sound of Stuka dive bombers became the soundtrack of her adolescence. Buildings she had passed every day on her way to school collapsed into dust. Neighbors disappeared. Food became scarce, then scarcer. By the time Warsaw surrendered on September 27, over 25,000 civilians were dead, and the city Wanda had known existed only in memory. The occupation that followed was designed to erase Poland entirely. Governor General Hans Frank announced that Poles would become slaves of the German Reich. Schools beyond elementary level were closed. Libraries were burned. Intellectuals, priests, and teachers were arrested and executed in systematic campaigns meant to decapitate Polish society. The Gertz family watched helplessly as their world contracted into survival. Wanda's father lost his position. Her older brother disappeared into forced labor. Her sister lived in constant fear of random roundups where young women were seized for factory work in Germany. But what transformed Wanda from a frightened child into something harder happened on a cold afternoon in November 1939. She was walking home from standing in a bread line when she witnessed a German soldier strike an elderly Jewish man who hadn't removed his hat quickly enough. The old man fell. The soldier kicked him repeatedly while other soldiers laughed. Polish civilians passing by looked away, their faces blank with the practiced indifference that was already becoming the survival strategy of occupied Warsaw. Wanda didn't look away. She stood frozen, watching, something crystallizing inside her chest. Rage. Pure and absolute. That night, she asked her father why no one had helped the old man. Her father's answer was careful, measured, delivered in the whisper that had already become necessary in occupied Poland. Because helping means dying, he said. Because the Germans shoot 10 Poles for every act of resistance. Because we must survive until this passes. Wanda heard the words. She understood the logic, but something in her rejected it completely. She was 13 years old, and she had just discovered that there were things worse than dying. Compliance was one of them. Watching was another. Over the next 2 years, Wanda grew up in an environment of systematic brutality. She learned to recognize the sound of boots on cobblestones that meant a roundup was coming. She learned which streets to avoid and which alleys offered escape routes. She learned that her Jewish classmates were being forced into a walled ghetto and that speaking to them could result in execution. She learned that the penalty for possessing a radio was death, for teaching was death, for hiding Jews was death. Everything was death. And in learning this, Wanda Gertz learned something else. She was no longer afraid. By 1941, Wanda Gertz no longer existed, at least not as a girl. The transformation was deliberate, methodical, and born of brutal necessity. The Polish resistance had identified a weakness in German security. They rarely suspected boys. Young men could move through checkpoints with less scrutiny, carry messages without being searched as thoroughly, blend into the crowds of laborers and street vendors that filled occupied Warsaw. Wanda was small, androgynous, with sharp features that could pass as masculine under the right conditions. A resistance contact, a former theater costumer, taught her how to bind her chest, how to walk with a wider gait, how to lower her voice to a neutral register that wouldn't betray her. She cut her hair herself with kitchen scissors, watching in the mirror as the girl disappeared and the boy emerged. Her code name became Kazik, a common Polish diminutive that could belong to anyone. She practiced for hours. The slouch, the spit, the way boys shoved their hands in pockets. Every gesture was rehearsed until it became unconscious. The decision to join the resistance hadn't been hers alone. In early 1941, her older sister had made contact with a cell operating in their district. They needed couriers, people who could carry messages, documents, weapons between safe houses without attracting attention. The work was desperately dangerous. Couriers caught with resistance materials were executed immediately, often in public as warnings, but the network was hemorrhaging personnel to arrests and needed replacements. When Wanda's sister suggested her younger sibling, the cell leader had been skeptical. 15 years old, female, small even for her age, but they were desperate. They agreed to test her. The first assignment was simple. Carry a sealed envelope from an apartment on Złota Street to a bookshop on Nowy Świat. The route took her through 2 German checkpoints. Wanda wrapped the envelope in oilcloth and tucked it into her shoe. She wore her brother's old clothes, a cap pulled low, and practiced his slouching walk. At the first checkpoint, a Wehrmacht soldier barely glanced at her. At the second, an SS officer stopped her, demanded papers, asked where she was going. Wanda's voice didn't waver. She was delivering a package for her employer, a baker. The officer stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then he waved her through. She delivered the envelope. The bookshop owner, an older woman with gray hair and careful eyes, looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You'll do," she said simply. That was Wanda's recruitment into the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army, the largest resistance organization in occupied Europe. But carrying messages wasn't enough. By 1942, the resistance had evolved beyond intelligence gathering and sabotage. They had begun targeted assassinations of collaborators, Gestapo informers, and particularly brutal occupation officials. The policy was controversial, even within resistance ranks. Some argued that assassinations brought terrible reprisals for every German killed. The Nazis executed dozens of Polish civilians. Others countered that allowing collaboration to go unpunished would destroy Polish morale and make occupation permanent. The assassinations continued. Wanda volunteered. Her cell leader refused initially. She was too young, too small, too valuable as a courier. But Wanda was insistent with an intensity that made hardened resistance fighters uncomfortable. She had watched 3 years of occupation. She had seen too much. She needed to do more than carry papers. She needed to strike back. Finally, reluctantly, they agreed to train her. The training was conducted in a safe house basement by a former Polish army officer. He taught her how to field strip and reassemble a vis pistol blindfolded, how to aim for center mass, not the heads move, bodies don't, how to approach a target from angles that minimized witnesses, how to walk away from a killing without running, without panic, with the casual indifference of someone who had simply been passing by. He taught her that hesitation kills and that mercy is a luxury resistance fighters cannot afford. Most importantly, he taught her to divorce the act of killing from emotion. You're not murdering, he explained. You're executing. There's a difference. Wanda absorbed it all. She practiced until the mechanics became muscle memory, and when her instructor finally declared her ready, she asked for her first assignment. The target was a Polish police officer named Władysław Koźdon, a collaborator who had sent at least 15 Jewish families to the Gestapo and personally participated in roundups that ended in Treblinka. The resistance had sentenced him to death. They gave the assignment to Wanda. She was 16 years old and had never killed anyone. The weapon was a vis pistol, Polish-made, reliable, with a full magazine of 8 rounds. Her handler explained the mechanics. Approach from behind, close range, 2 shots to the back of the head. Walk away at normal speed. Never run. Running attracts attention. She followed Koźdon for 3 days, learning his route from his apartment to the police station, identifying the moment of maximum isolation, a narrow street near Żelazna where he walked alone each morning at 7:15. On the 4th morning, she wore her boy's clothing and fell into step behind him. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it would burst through her chest. 20 meters, 15, 10. She pulled the pistol from her jacket. Everything her instructor had taught her evaporated in that moment. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was ragged. Koźdon was just a man in a police uniform, walking to work, perhaps thinking about breakfast or his family or nothing at all. Wanda's finger found the trigger. She thought about the 15 Jewish families. She thought about the children who had been loaded onto trains to Treblinka because this man had pointed at doors and said, "Jews hiding here." She thought about how many people were dead because of him. She fired twice. The sound was deafening in the narrow street. Koźdon collapsed forward without a sound, his body hitting the cobblestones with a wet, heavy thud. Wanda stood frozen, the pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Time seemed to stop. Then instinct took over. She lowered the weapon, slipped it back into her jacket, and walked away at a measured pace. Her legs felt like water. Her vision was tunneled. Behind her, someone started screaming. She made it 3 blocks before she vomited in an alley. Her entire body was shaking uncontrollably. She had killed a man. She had pointed a weapon at another human being and ended his life. The magnitude of it crashed over her in waves. This wasn't training. This wasn't practice. This was real, permanent, irreversible. The safe house was a 4th-floor apartment on Marzokowska Street. Wanda climbed the stairs on legs that barely functioned, gave the coded knock, and stumbled inside. Her handler was waiting. He took the pistol from her hands without speaking, guided her to a chair, and poured her a glass of water. She couldn't drink it. She couldn't stop shaking. "Did I kill him?" she asked. Her handler nodded. "He was dead before he hit the ground," he said. "You did well." Wanda didn't feel like she had done well. She felt like she had committed an irreversible act that had changed something fundamental about who she was. Her handler seemed to understand. "The first one is always the hardest," he said. "It gets easier." But it didn't get easier, not really. Over the following months, Wanda would execute 6 more collaborators. Each time, the mechanics became smoother, the approach more confident, the escape more efficient. But the weight never lessened. She carried each name, each face, each moment of pulling the trigger. She told herself they were necessary deaths. She told herself they were executions, not murders. She told herself, that in war, killing the enemy isn't a crime. But late at night, alone in her family's apartment, she would lie awake and wonder what she was becoming. She was 16 years old and she had killed 7 people. The girl who had watched an old Jewish man being beaten in 1939 seemed like someone from another lifetime. That girl had been outraged by violence. This new version of herself dispensed it with mechanical precision. And the most terrifying part wasn't the killing itself, it was how normal it had started to feel. Wanda Gertz had executed 7 collaborators. The Gestapo knew someone was operating in Warsaw's Śródmieście district, someone small, young, possibly female, though witnesses were unreliable and often contradicted each other. They called the unknown assassin the Phantom in their internal reports. They increased patrols, offered rewards, tortured suspects. But Wanda had become something more dangerous than skilled. She had become confident. Confidence, her handlers warned, was the first step toward capture. She ignored them. On June 18, 1943, she was assigned to kill a Volksdeutscher named Otto Schuler, a Polish citizen of German descent who had enthusiastically joined the Nazi apparatus and was responsible for denouncing dozens of resistance members. The operation was supposed to be straightforward. Schuler walked the same route every evening from his office to a café on Marszałkowska Street. But on this evening, Gestapo counterintelligence had set a trap. They had been watching Schuler too, waiting for the Phantom to strike. Wanda didn't see the surveillance team. She had grown too comfortable in her boy's disguise, too confident in her ability to move through occupied Warsaw undetected. She followed Schuler for 2 blocks, waiting for the optimal moment, the narrow passage between 2 buildings where witnesses would be minimal. She closed the distance. Her hand moved toward the pistol concealed in her jacket. Then someone grabbed her from behind. Strong hands locked around her arms, lifting her off her feet. She tried to fight, tried to reach the cyanide capsules sewn into her collar, but there were too many of them. 3 Gestapo agents in civilian clothes, moving with practiced coordination. One forced her hands behind her back. Another ripped open her jacket, finding the Viz pistol. The third pressed a hand over her mouth to muffle her screams. They dragged her into a waiting car. Schuler stood on the sidewalk, watching with a smile. He had been bait. The Gestapo had suspected the Phantom would come for him eventually and had turned him into a lure. Wanda had walked directly into it. The car drove through darkening streets toward Schucher Avenue Gestapo headquarters in Warsaw. Wanda's mind was racing. The screams that echoed from the windows, the bodies that were carried out at dawn. She thought about the cyanide capsule, still sewn into her collar, now unreachable. She thought about the names in her head: safe houses, contacts, other resistance members. Under torture, everyone talked eventually. The Gestapo knew this. Wanda knew this. The interrogation began immediately. They took her to a basement room with a single chair bolted to the floor and a drain in the center. Blood stains darkened the concrete. The Gestapo officer who questioned her was middle-aged, professional, speaking fluent Polish with a German accent. He asked her name. She gave him the prepared false identity. Krystyna Nowak. He asked why she was carrying a pistol. She said she had found it in the street, was going to sell it. He asked why she was following Otto Schuler. She said she wasn't following anyone. He hit her across the face with the back of his hand. The blow was casual, almost absent-minded. Then he asked the questions again. She gave the same answers. He hit her again, harder this time. Blood filled her mouth. He asked if she was the Phantom. She said she didn't know what that meant. He showed her photographs: 7 dead men, 7 executions. "Your work," he said. She shook her head. The beating continued for hours. Methodical, systematic, designed to inflict maximum pain without causing unconsciousness. Wanda clung to her training. Say nothing. Admit nothing. Protect the network. But her body was betraying her. The pain was overwhelming. She could feel herself fragmenting, the carefully constructed identity beginning to crack. Then the Gestapo officer tried a different approach. "We know you're a girl," he said quietly. "We know you're young. Maybe 15, 16. You've been manipulated by older men, used as a weapon. Tell us who recruited you, who gave you orders, and we'll be lenient. You're a victim too." Wanda almost laughed. The casualness of the lie was almost insulting. She said nothing. They took her to Pawiak prison at dawn. The fortress loomed against the grey Warsaw sky, its walls stained dark with decades of suffering. Wanda was processed, photographed, assigned a number. Prisoner 7,841. She was thrown into a cell with 14 other women, most of them political prisoners, all of them waiting for either execution or transport to concentration camps, none of them expected to survive. Pawiak prison stood in the heart of Warsaw, like a monument to suffering. Built by the Russians in the 1832 to imprison Polish patriots, it had been repurposed by the Gestapo into an interrogation center, where screams echoed through stone corridors and executions were carried out in the courtyard every morning. Wanda Gertz arrived at Pawiak on June 20, 1943, 2 days after her capture. She had been beaten during arrest, rifle butts to the ribs, kicks to the stomach, but had revealed nothing. Not her real name, not her contacts, not the location of safe houses. She gave them a false identity. Kristina Nowak, a street vendor, caught in the wrong place. They didn't believe her. The interrogations began immediately. Gestapo officers worked in shifts, one screaming, one calm, alternating between violence and false promises of leniency. They showed her photographs of executed resistance members, told her she would die the same way unless she cooperated. Wanda stared at them with eyes that had already seen too much death to be frightened by photographs. The cell she shared with 14 other women measured 4 meters by 3. There were no beds, only wooden planks along the walls. The single toilet was a bucket in the corner that was emptied once a day if the guards remembered. The smell was indescribable. The women slept in shifts, because there wasn't room for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Lice were constant. Disease was rampant. Twice a day, a guard shoved bowls of watery soup through the slot in the door. The soup contained mostly water, sometimes a few pieces of rotting potato, occasionally something that might have once been meat. But the worst part wasn't the conditions. It was the executions. Every morning at dawn, guards would arrive, call out names, and take prisoners to the courtyard. Sometimes 10 names, sometimes 20, sometimes just 2 or 3. The women left behind would listen to the gunfire, crisp, methodical volleys that meant another group of prisoners had been shot against the courtyard wall. Then silence. Then the guards would return for the next shift of interrogations. Wanda learned the rhythm of Pawiak quickly. Morning executions, midday interrogations, evening silence. The Gestapo was trying to break her through psychological pressure as much as physical torture. They wanted her to hear the gunfire and imagine herself standing against that wall. They wanted her to know that every day she refused to talk was another day closer to execution. The interrogations continued for weeks. They tried everything: beatings, sleep deprivation, starvation. They brought in a woman who claimed to be a fellow resistance member, hoping Wanda would reveal information, thinking she was among friends. Wanda saw through it immediately and said nothing. They showed her forged documents claiming her family had been arrested and would be executed unless she cooperated. Wanda couldn't know if it was true or false, but she maintained silence. What the Gestapo didn't understand was that Wanda had already made peace with death. She had killed 7 people. She had walked through occupied Warsaw dispensing execution sentences. She had accepted that this work would eventually lead to her own death. The only question had been when. Now she knew. The when was soon. The only thing that mattered was protecting the others. In early August, the interrogations stopped. A Gestapo officer informed her she had been sentenced to death by hanging. No trial, no appeal. Just a sentence delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. Execution date: August 17th, 1943. 3 days away. Wanda spent those 3 days in her cell, waiting. The other women tried to comfort her, but there was nothing to say. She was 17 years old, and she was going to die. She thought about her family. She thought about the 7 men she had killed. She thought about whether any of it had mattered. The resistance would continue without her. Someone else would carry messages. Someone else would execute collaborators. She was replaceable. They were all replaceable. That was the nature of underground war. On the morning of August 17th, guards came for her at dawn. They led her through the corridors toward the courtyard where executions were carried out. Wanda walked with her head up, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of the courtyard, they took her to an office where a Wehrmacht officer sat behind a desk reviewing paperwork. "Your sentence has been commuted," he said without looking up. "You will be transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp for labor service." Wanda didn't understand. Why commute the sentence? The officer offered no explanation. She was simply processed, given a transport number, and 3 days later loaded onto a cattle car with 80 other women bound for Germany. She would never know the real reason. Perhaps the Gestapo had decided she had intelligence value and wanted more time to break her. Perhaps bureaucratic confusion had temporarily saved her life. Perhaps somewhere in the Nazi apparatus, someone had made an arbitrary decision that resulted in her living instead of dying. Wanda Gertz survived Ravensbrück. She survived until liberation in April 1945. She returned to Warsaw weighing less than 80 pounds, suffering from tuberculosis and trauma that would never fully heal. She was 19 years old and had lived 3 lifetimes. The girl who had watched an old man being beaten in 1939 was gone completely, replaced by something harder, something that had seen the absolute depths of human cruelty and somehow emerged on the other side.